장사와단 주진 샤바당 예수 이랑 구징 소와이
개와 종세 다기 제사파 남제 다기 장제 실모 사지 부주주 메도 참르라 롱제니르데 ям바인데 상제 장도 메데 보르와예 로건 남다 장라 조퍼조 에단 고로라나 만달라 거늘야다야메 샘체남기 삼바당 로예 챕터 제타월 최종 도모 타바이 주진 골로 골도소이 두수마산기 담제기고 리당진 고를 잠수 잡도 같은 송담함 시바제성 환근사의 일라마름보 잡지 바모들 점함에 발랑고 우랍도 때때 구비정 사정 잡수니 버런치오 신기 라퍼른 잘도 솔이 공개자성 따위 મં고게 서른 준비당 자정 상회zem조소 사르윈 조건메크 더처런 겨 특지 남마코니 주로 지든 숨지 공자비 또한 밤마 가루 제바 테랑 달루 연솔 종 organ 솔라 밤미 동보로 게르이 남처럼 전론 기트 산당 회브제 연든 종바르와 밤맘 종니 냥가 밤모이로 곰볼로 드바리안 대화당 도메잉님 쇼랑 주기적 주종연시 과오절라소 잠라겐 종남라 무션잘 마리 상김 캐르빈양라 거 건도장 볼몰만 넘버장 집지 게르인 틀린 전자비 마밤잠비 양라 구션잘 지금 차트 좀비 텔라광 번종라 바솜제연던조 화이 반딤 종의 이름 보지 전초 과들라 라마르 솔와안데 조숨동아래 진다 캐긴 켄느냐 소매 공시워를 길라 샘진돈 돈유도 덕소나 담바남기 num도 잘도 솔 남카당 냠베 샘신 탐지기 돈도 단데라나메바 양도 버족비 상디지 고마운 보제 도버 샤티브셔도 담비주 강제 산니 또냠 슬랑월 요르 냠도 삼밥샹 쇼도 투케 바당 추냠 비코노 쇼파남 쟈랑토로 마주르기데 산찰
Think, in order to bring all sentient beings equal to the extent of space to unsurpassed ultimate happiness, I will attain the authentic and perfect precious state of awakening. And to accomplish that, I will listen to the sublime Dharma, and then I will practice its meaning. In this way, please cultivate this motivation, the supreme aspiration of bodhicitta, and adopt the proper conduct for receiving Dharma as the means to listen to these teachings.
테니 gembarke nge kyaran tolap shatkyo pa namjin 테니 디 곤롱 사른뎁시 비니 kamna tangama shunjukur kaptan gyati laglenki kaptan devjin to lobjong tondon mi kap tetagla sopi lobjong kur kap tamchi kani kamna shat yopi tanga tu gembar te kari tangu yore sena ne teni sosu semta zangmapshi pa semta 곤홍 zangwo chikke pa te ta gu yore di chetan 곤홍 ambayo to chok tamche te pap juya te ju gerya te gir 오 tani ju gir fang tani chini cha chang pa chang map zo ni o ti chap la na sem nang la kari khar gu ko yo re zena ta tani cham min nam ji te tani shamba chammet nyang je chammet devjin to gawa chammet tamnyum chammet te delta u chammet nam ba ji yenayang ra yang na tani shang chup ko sem te nyang ji yanton la mek bi zur te 아, yanton tongir kan dombatang yang hirip ki shangchub la mek bi zur te shangchub tongir kan domba zaya te o tani ko tani semchik semnang la khar goho yore tani mdor na mdor tsib dubjag na ta yipi semchen tamchit te tani dungar yumri tangchi pa di ngi chik kyab go sam te tawu kyapar shawi cheto khatsangin di nang la parshim paramita jipi nikab hirb ki parto shimbi nikab nim shapar tarto teni zong teni paror nyangal nindi pi kompang topar shego sam o te topar shawi cheto ni hirb ki parto shimbi zhong dala tubab shekayin sambab shekayin gombab shekayin samyate o ti kolhong cha chang te yakbo chik changgo kyo res.
So, as always, Rinpoche said, I often lead with the reminder of our intention, the thoughts that motivate us, and cultivating that intention prior to actions. And that motivation and the cultivation of that we've studied in texts such as Entering the Way of a Bodhisattva, such as the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva, such as the 7 Key Points of Mind Training, and many other teachings which I've given on mind training. And it's from those teachings that we want to draw upon those teachings in order to cultivate this intention, in order to learn how to essentially sort of clean our mind prior when we're setting our motivation so that we can sort of clean out all the negative thoughts and cultivate a kind heart, the most pure of intentions that we could generate. And so what that means is becoming keenly aware of the thoughts in our mind, the mental states motivating us. And when we see any negative thought processes, emotions present as our motivation factors, that we then change those, that we transform those, that we eliminate those. That's what I mean, Rinpoche said, by clean, that we sort of let go of, do what we need to reduce and eliminate those factors, and then purposely choose then and cultivate the positive thoughts to motivate us, such as meditating on the 4 immeasurables: immeasurable loving kindness, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable rejoicing, immeasurable equanimity. And so in this way, we want to train in these qualities, or specifically, for example, train in bodhicitta itself, in which we have the 2-fold focus. The first is the compassionate aim to benefit others, where we're motivated out of the wish to pursue the welfare of other living beings. And the second is the wisdom that sees the means to doing so is the attainment of total purification and realization of the state of awakening or enlightenment in order to benefit beings. And so we're motivated out of compassion and out of the wisdom that sees the way to accomplish that. And or if we were to kind of look at those 2 aims in another way, in kind of a brief summary, we can generate that compassion towards all infinite sentient beings and think I am committed to protecting and freeing them from suffering and the causes of suffering. And in order to do so, then I will cultivate the profound wisdom that brings us to the other side, the prajna paramita. aka the perfection of wisdom that brings us to the other side, that brings all those beings to a transcendence of suffering, nirvana, that they can all attain that state. And in order to accomplish this, I'm going to listen to these teachings here today on the Heart Sutra. I'm going to listen to the teachings. I'm going to then contemplate and reflect on their meaning, and then I'm going to meditate on them. And so in this way, we cultivate the best possible motivation as our reason for being here today.
Teni ndo yinir kapna long chigyore, churnam kunki ngundu yidnror te ze chigyore. Tib shirna nga tsu lika kare kanshik lina yana, ti ngundu semt nro kyore esiri. Tangpo semt tib shawab shede on kyore. Samlo chik har kyore, konlong chik ke on kyore. Karte konlong ngamba chik ke na na, teni kyu lika te yang, kang lipi lika te yang, teni korang konlong ngambi shipa imbi jimtsanki lika te yang, yakpo chik yongo yo mar. Karte kyu dripi lika te yang yakpo chik yongo mena, tela teni shongi maung pim dribu te yang ngamba chik shongo yore. Oya, deb shinto teni tomani rang samba te yakpo chik goni, jan la pansim goni, konlong zang chik goni lika te lina ne, di topki rang shawa dribya te yang lamro yongo yore. Rang shawa dripa te yakpo chik ro sona ne, teni maung pa tim dribu te yang yakpo yongo yore. O tip shirna ne, konlong te tak ma tak tang, samba yakpo te yinming goni, chachang ni tamchen gerwa roko yore. Oya, tere, teni huena rang sosu jitsuk la yapshibshi na yang ra. Teni yana rang lihka liwa nen ro na yang ra nima re ribshinta. Sosu sem ngamba chik togni, vdak jinzan tang, vdak konlong nga chik topndo tang. Nga nda topgo khandu, te topgo khandu, samya chik ton tog nyer shaate em te so rang to nying yodna, kyo ngipar te nyong rab shong kare. Kyo lihka lihiyo pi kabla, kyo tina nyong ra yong kare. Kare tina, jamba ka ke mare teni rang ka sem kup samlo, te teni ngamba chik togni kyo lihiyo re. Ti gimtsan ki teni kyo kerang ka togla, kangar ching chat yong kyo re. O te tabore, ti shir nan teni churnam kun ki ngon to yin ror te, ze sem te kare yin na yang chu tam chik nga tsu lihka kare li na ti ngon to, ngi par te sem kup samlo chik ngon lan rogo yo re. Te teni yak mayak gimtsan lap teni, maung pip shawa yak po tang, tim dribu yak po chik shong mab shong te la, ten jam rinjong re, ze kar sangi ju pa namshin, ten jam rinjong mar tok pi chunga yo pa may no, se re. Ter jam rinjong mar tok pi chunga yang, fana mananga yang yo mar re. Oya te tawo chik teni tugo re, tip shir nam, sem zayate tar top chehu re. Sem zayate zo chehu tere. Nga tsu lunga yiksum ki nangni kyang zo chehu re te, kora nam nyangan lindi pi chu kang ina marcha sem la tugo re. Tar tsawa chachang sem ka tog lab samlo tang, sem ka tog ni teni mjong yo pa tang, jirten ti tog la lep yong yo pa, ti tog la tuk yo pa te, nga tsu ngi par te hako ya go chik re. Tip shena, namgyun teni sem yakpo chik tang, konlong yakpo chik, samba yakpo chik, kang tap tap she go yo pa ti gemtsan, ten tip shini yong yo re se.
In the sutras, there's a scripture which states, prior to all phenomena comes the mind, which is to say, before we do anything, before that is a thought. Before any action, there is a thought that arises in the mind that precedes it. And so preceding all phenomena comes the mind. It's always first. And if that thought then is one that is negative and afflictive, then the subsequent actions based on that also will be of that nature. And then the future results of that also will not be positive, will not be good. And so everything stems outwards from the thoughts that motivate us. Begin within the initial thought that arises in our mind. And so when those thoughts are toward others of a kind-hearted nature, of the wish to benefit them, then the subsequent actions that we engage in are also likewise based on that and thereby positive. And then their future result is also a reflection of that and thereby positive. And so everything boils down to our motivation, and motivation means the thoughts that we think, the place from which our mind takes action. And then what changes, what makes the action and the result of that action positive or negative is the mind behind it, is the thoughts behind it. So whatever kinds of activities we might be engaging in, perhaps it's service. We're engaging in service-oriented activities in our community. Or perhaps it's our daily work, our job, our career. But whatever the action is, whatever the undertaking is, if it begins with this focus on a self, that's grasping to self, that's fixated on ourself and thinking of and motivated out of how we feel because of that, what we get out of that, what we want out of that, what we need out of it, and it's all centered around looking at what we get out of that, then we're always going to be encountering things that are difficult. We're always going to have issues or problems in those endeavors. And that's because of where the starting point from where the thoughts come, the motivating factors. And so then the actions will be reflective of those motivating factors, and then their results as well. And so prior to all phenomena comes the mind. And that really is the principal determinant as to the nature of those actions being positive or negative, and the future outcome and results, the karmic sort of results, not necessarily the immediate effects of those actions being also positive or negative. Because everything that occurs in dependence upon and in relation to those factors, its own causes and conditions, is dependently occurring. As we spoke about yesterday, there is no phenomena that is not dependently occurring. None whatsoever. And so then when we look at our mind, this is the most sort of powerful factor or determinant in our experience. Of our body, speech, and mind, the mind is the principal factor, but also what determines the experience of samsara or nirvana, what makes it one or the other, is the mind. It's entirely rooted upon our mind. It comes down to our mind. It boils down to our mind. The foundation or basis of what we experience is our mind. Everything comes back to the mind as the underlying factor in every experience. And this is something that we want to constantly be aware of and then be vigilant in terms of checking our motivation, of recognizing the power of the underlying thoughts that are motivating us and striving to the very best of our capacity to cultivate kind thoughts, positive thoughts that care about the welfare of others and so forth. So?
건홍 장은제데 삼밥 장오다 남바제디 샤와 거랑 연결와 람상 로케오 바데 가서 살고래 회나 가서 회칙지나 드니 가서 김버트 mosquitoes are very very annoying. We everybody know that. Then mosquito chik chu ni ngola vap ni rang la so jap kyo na te ti khong thong da wo lang yong kyo re. Te la lang ni des tap sam ba khong thong lang so a. Te lang na te ni ta lam sang sa ya ge charge re. Khong thong dang jib yin to. Te kon long ngam ba te di che ge yo re. We na lam sang re khong thong te re wa. Te ni kerang ke garte mosquito to chik khong thong lang yong kyo na oh lamsang mosquito la nyangje chik keso na kyusak ka mare. Korang tapki chik shed ni rotap she jakare. Gare dina gunlong nyangje chik khasong. Di top ki semchen lag no pamam shed pate yonggo yore. Khwe te namshin nga tsu shawa gare hinna nga terwa. Muk chik lam chak tok chik shi na. Khwe na ta nga tso chu dum kanan nan tsam tsam la chu ba te tso chik nang la yang chak tok yore. Ngar ger yore chik nang la. Khonsu ngar ger tang chak tok yopi kabla kyu lih ka kare li na yang kyu ngar ger tang chak tok lih kare. Yagpo yo mar. Tip shawa te yagpo drupka yo mar kerang. Gar zina kunlong to dukja chak song wari. Gar te ngar ger tang chak tok ki na yang. Teni lam sang o te kunlong ten rigo mar eb sam ni. Teni chik rang ka chutuk te zola nyang je tang, tsewa tang. Teni nyam len chik samlo tang ni. Di zin bi go ni kyu shawa te drup na na kaka koko chik tsari. Lirkate. Khwen na nga tsu tang sang zambu lang ka gang lak mang chuk mang pon drop yin ba te tso yang ta lam sang tsam jik jik go na tsam jik tabiya chik te khwen na ndir ta wu sambab zang wo te zhen zin la sok pa ya hombo ka ki ka sem nang la kye so na lam sang tsam jik she tup kyo re te kong cho dang chak tok dang ngar ge di wang ki nam yang tsam jik she kyo mar te kyang tsu ha go gdo wa te nga tsu sar wo ra wa kyang tsu sam lo tong dang tar tan zambu lang kan di mo te tsu gil la zo te tsu gil la nguni nang pi luk lap sha ki yo pin di tsame nam she ta wo chik pu chik ke so na kan re yin sa re kong tsu mang chuk sang nin tsam jik she kare ngi kari ze ki yo ze na ne samba zang wo tang ngam ba ze ya di xie li tang di nu ba de kare chi do kyo re kan re top chen bo chik dok o ten di re ze
We shouldn't underestimate the thoughts that motivate us, positive thoughts, positive motivation, or negative motivation, because they completely change the nature of the action. And the expression of those thoughts is very different. For example, if you have a mosquito land on your forehead, which I know everybody thinks mosquitoes are very annoying, so we'll take that into consideration. So a mosquito lands on the forehead, then most often people feel an anger, like a sense of aversion or aggression, like upset. They don't like it. And then immediately with that anger or aggression, then that negative thought, the expression of that is that typically then they just smack their forehead and kill it. That's the action that is a reflection of that anger, that thought, that emotion in the mind. If, on the other hand, the mosquito lands on your forehead and you don't like it, you have that moment of anger, but then you have that like self-awareness and you're like, oh, this being, and you feel compassion for that being, and you have an empathy for that being, then you don't kill it. And you find other ways to prevent it from landing on you, and so forth. Maybe you just simply wipe it away gently. So look at the difference between the thought, the compassionate thought that's motivating an action at that moment versus an angry thought that's motivating an action at that moment. The action is different. One causes harm to another being. Another does not. And all actions are like that. And this happens in all kinds of different ways. For example, sometimes like in Dharma centers or amongst Dharma practitioners, there might be like they're practitioners of the Dharma and then they have like jealousy towards one another, or they have an arrogance or a kind of a pride or ego sort of towards one another. And if they're coming to an action, like say even a Dharma activity, but then they're coming to it out of pride or out of kind of a envy or jealousy towards others, however that might look in the mind, whatever that action is, regardless of how good it looks, it is happening because of those emotions of their own pride and their own jealousy, and the action itself is not ultimately positive. It's not actually beneficial, even if, no matter how it looks. But if then the practitioner
머게바리 규샹사나 공투고니
so like if
샹치나
you
머게바리
prostrate and you're angry, that is
턱턱고니
non-virtuous.
샹치나 머게바리.
If you prostrate out of jealousy, non-virtuous.
오케이 큐때 맞아
If you-
칸돈동 값이나 Heart Sutra
If you're
로그니
doing the Heart Sutra and you're
턱턱고니
doing it because you're jealous and you're having
바라마타
envy
수다야고 가든다
and you're
가든다
just
바트
like
우칭난
reciting it like that,
머게바리.
non-virtuous.
오케이.
Not beneficial. So if as a practitioner then we have that awareness and we recognize, our ego involved or envy or competitiveness involved there, and we see that kind of will completely undermine the nature of this action. And we shift our view towards care, a genuine respect and care for the others, like other Sangha, we have love and compassion. And then we apply that and then we engage in that same action. Then we have a very different nature of the action. Sometimes we might not really realize the true power of our mind in circumstances, but this example, while on the far end of the spectrum, really shows us how powerful our mind is, which is, for example, right now in the world, there are all of these wars being waged. So if you look at what would be the single factor in which that war would simply stop, what is one factor? If the president or the leader, whichever sort of political arrangement that country has, if the leader of that group, the person who's instigating the war, were to suddenly feel deep compassion towards all living beings involved, that war would end at that moment. But for as long as the anger and the jealousy and the pride and all of these other factors are motivating them, it will never end. Very difficult for it to come to an end. And when we look at that, we can clearly see the difference between these two motivating factors. If we were to imagine someone who's instigating or waging war against any people, at that moment, if they were to meditate on the four immeasurable qualities and genuinely give rise to them, that would be the end of the war, the beginning of the end. Even just one day meditating on that, maybe the next day their whole outlook or perspective would have changed. If they do it well, if they truly generate those
teni dago
qualities.
nukuk chenpo yore.
So what I'm saying is it has that power. And that power is the same even on the small minutiae of the daily details of our life and the thoughts that are motivating us action to action. And so we want to recognize the difference between when our thoughts that are motivating us are of a kind heart or when they're afflictive, and understand the function that that serves and what that does, and don't underestimate the power of our mind in every action, in everything that we do. Also.
teni karsa tsu tawa tencham renjong tang shopan sewa mepi goni, tawa tencham renjong tso hirip tu yore, shopan sewa mepate, terang imdor duba, tsamjik yang kyang tola ti togni, sopchit martong pansum yuwa yensi.
And so then yesterday we explored the view of dependent origination and the conduct of doing no harm as sort of like the summary of all the teachings. And that view of dependent origination is based on the cultivation of wisdom. And so then today I simply wanted to sort of reinforce and fulfill that aspect of our ongoing discussion on this. So.
Ngi tani tsawi lama yibjin noru kong la, damgar chik yore, kong ka di damgar te nga tsu pe tangsang haliba chenpo chik tsaka yore, te chu dang jik te niki lukla do tamgan chik re. Rang tsuk manchor zaya chik tang, jansim mahtuk zaya chik te yore. Rang tsuk manchor zaya na kar zaya kore zaya na muluk yin na rang nyan la yagpo chik yor na, gewi shoksuk nipi positive kang tang kang ka yon tan chik yor na, te manyam par chi pi tonde. Nyamlin chik yor na te manyam pa chi is, ken kang tang kang shik chan na yang, rang ka sem ka nyamlin ka tsuk te gewi cha te, nyamlin kan chik yin na, nyamlin ka tsuk te makor ba chi zay na te rang tsuk ma shor zay kyor. Lu tang ngak tang yis sum ki gwani. Masa ki top sa sona kyulu ngak yis sum ki gwani, sa tsuk khor song wani. Tani jan sem maktuk zay chik yore. Telap tani jan ki sem tong kyop che gu kyor esri. Jan ki sem kang tap tap ki gwani, jan ki sem tukhu yo na mantuk par she pi rokpa she ya tang. Kwe na nyumong pa kang tang kang ka tukhu yo na. Kaarte tani rang ka jan ki sem mantuk par she pa, maktuk par she pa chik, jan ki sem tongwa chik she pa te go song re. Ta tela shi ko wa tang, nang ko wa, sangwi ko wa, mambo ko ya chik yo re. Ta yin na yang, ngi te nga kya nga to chang so chik she, nda pan tok pen dok. Tani rang tsuk ma shor ze na, nyamlin kan chik yin na rang ka sem ka nyamlin ta khot tok me pa chan ho, yam san, lam sang tang ka yo re. Jan sem maktuk zena, jan lag no pap she sam ka yo na rang ka, lunga yik som jik no pap she sam ka yo na, ten ti kabla tan tab ka yo re. O tindi ka dom tsika ni re, ta kya nga tsu sem lab zong rok chi, nima chik la ngay ti tol na gipa chik sha sam ka yo, tindi res.
I want to share, Rinpoche said, some key advice given by my own root guru, Yizhen Norbu, His Holiness Jigme Phuntsok Rinpoche. And he has this piece of advice that is extremely poignant and is very applicable to everything going on these days, and it's something that applies to all situations, both worldly and spiritual, the Dharma. And so it's two statements, and the first is, don't lose your own ground. And the second is, don't disturb others' minds. So don't lose your own ground has many layers of meaning, but in a nutshell, then on a worldly way, it means like no matter what is going on in the world, that we don't lose our integrity and sight of the value of positive thought and action. And so no matter what is arising, that we don't let kind of like the noble and moral
Positive.
sort of positive aspects of behaviors and so forth to decline. So we don't lose our own ground. Then in terms of our practice, it means no matter what conditions we encounter, that we don't use that as an excuse not to practice, that we don't lose our practice. So no matter what conditions they are, that we stay rooted in our practice and in our commitment to cultivating what's positive and virtuous. And so then don't lose your own ground, mentally and then physically and verbally. So if we get upset and we kill the mosquito, we've lost our own ground of practice, physically, verbally, mentally. Then the second of these is don't disturb others' minds. And so essentially
Not so mosquito, like why you think there is three actions of body, speech, mind. And then you do this, and then your mind already acting you angry and already take actions, and body take actions, then you didn't say it, or you didn't if you didn't verbally, if you didn't say it, but actually that you need it, like that kind of motivation we had. Or sometimes people say these words too, and verbally. If we don't say it, but the mind is saying that. Always we talking, we answer the questions, all the time in my head, yeah? So we always doing that. Three actions. We just lost ground.
And then don't disturb others' minds boils down to the principle of don't harm others. And so then we are protecting then our own mind, not only protecting our own mind from disturbing emotions and being afflicted, but we're also guarding and protecting others and caring for others and concern for others. So in general, these two statements kind of cover every situation, both in a worldly way and in terms of our Dharma practice. And Rinpoche said there's a lot more meaning to be unpacked on different levels of these two statements, their outer meaning, inner meaning, and secret meaning. And I'm just bringing them up as a reminder because those are kind of important things that you can think of and always keep bear in mind to enable you to essentially not lose your own ground and not harm others. And so in the future, at some point, I'd like to give a more extensive kind of teaching on those because of the profound meaning that we can gain from them. But here I'm just giving this by means of a reminder to hold those in mind.
I wish you read down these two words and then you put that in your house, somewhere you always see it. It really helps. When you have even in the family issues, it helps when you see this, and you remind you, and you yeah, you know. So it's very, very important. You put that somewhere, even see it. You look at this because it's these two words. For example, in Laro Monastery in Tibet, we one point couple times we have to. It's too many people, too many 20,000 monks, nuns, and lay practitioners living one place like a big city. And then we have to have destroyed many houses, and we didn't like it. We didn't agree, but still you have to do one point. We did that. We lost. That's how everybody know that. That time, how these monks, nuns, practitioners, how they didn't disturb, how they didn't take any actions, these two words. They practiced these two words that saved Laro Monastery. If you take actions, I think finished Laro. So what I'm saying is this this peace advice, very, very petty instructions, very helpful, very powerful. But we sometimes practitioners, we totally lost, just only ordinary ways, thinking, doing. That's why we are in struggle, very, very big problems these days. Particularly if we don't take care of our own mind in these days, it's a very difficult time. Okay, so techi tatani hirabki paruto shimbandanin chaprapshi palane, tomorgewa laikitun wartugewa jontun tamargewa mjutun yopi nani. Tani ta wartugewa jontun shapi kabre. Jontun shapi kapnine, tani ta alangjite tampong atsu posum tsokpar ngai goni alangjite mapshate. Tani tiji tela alanghwate pshate. Jong de trawatang telenki goni shani zitang khari uniki. Trawatang telenki goni mjonsur alanghwi goni mapshaki yore. Tani tan dela na tani khari putak khari wu trawatini tani rikyu tang rikyu mo tamshiki khirabki partu shimbala nyamlin shina karifshi gu kre zeni ta khongka tani sanji ki kumdanni gendan chamchak mangpu kumdanni ya leng ya langni ya lang wana mena hako meta tani khongka tani trawati yore ti lan la shani ziki tani tombani ka hirab te la njukpi tsurte nga tsu hirab la njuk tsurte shak yorwa hirab karibshini hirab tandiri karchembo chumdandi ma hirab ki parto shimba se hirab tandiri karchembo inna tela karibshini njugu khanduk zena tani chu tamshiki niluk tongni diemba te tokku khanduk zeni pombo ngai ramjin tongni ki tokku khanduk tongni te tokku khanduk songni kariwu te songjagrawa ta ona te karere zena ta tera nga tsu tela tani lepsong te mapsha kiyens.
So now continuing with the main teachings that we're giving, which is a discussion of the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra, the meaning of the text can be divided into the beginning, the middle, and the conclusion. We're now in the main body of the text. And this begins with a preliminary introduction, providing the historical context of the teachings, which was pointing out the 5 excellent circumstances. And then the conditions in which the teaching came about. In the presence of the Buddha, how then Shariputra was moved to ask Avalokiteshvara a question. And essentially, Shariputra asked Avalokiteshvara, how should any son or daughter, how should any child of spiritual heritage proceed who wishes to realize wisdom, to practice the meaning of the Heart Sutra? And he did so in the presence of the Buddha and in the midst of an assembly of tens of thousands of practitioners there. And somehow, he was moved to ask this question. And thereby, Avalokiteshvara then empowered to respond and to answer this question and said, if we wish to realize the profound wisdom, emptiness, and engage in it, then we need to proceed as follows. And emphasizing that prajna, profound wisdom, is the mother of all Buddhas, the source from which all awakening comes, and the importance and value of that. And so how should anyone of spiritual good fortune who wishes to pursue that knowledge, that wisdom, how should they proceed? And he said they should proceed by realizing that the natural state or nature of all phenomena is emptiness. That the 5 mind-body aggregates are by nature empty. And so that's where we have arrived now in the discussion of what that means. Maso?
Okay, so ta teni nga tsu teni zuk tongpa o tongpa ni zuk so zuli kyang tongpa ni jen main tongpa ni kyang Zugjen maino jipandani maramba bjinto ta tombani 그 산니때 시작해요래. 그 간딘다오레스. 다 히릅제때 늘똑 비럼진 전치 고기요래. 늘똑 소나 티마나 히릅제기요레스. 대타우 히릅직 땅보 줄라께 퍼셰파 텔라네 다 닉니 감니 디츠그jet 페카르침보레. 히릅데 줄라께 퍼셰파테 땅보 토니 그 타와 탁탄라 팝고기요래. 드니 동화 동니 때 타와 탁탄라 팝. 탁탄라 팝니 gum고기요레데. 팁시나 테랑이 타와탄 라 팝니 드니 gum스르타 니카 냠토 강 탑탑라고 지니시작인 드니디 죽 똥바오 똥바니 죽 소주리 경 똥바니 젠마 똥바니 경 죽젠 마이노 지피 츠때 탑시르탄 그 하리피 잠모당 고와 메트모롱 와테 타 똥바니 치 고고 흐요나 니 위제트 고소나 차창 고로 흐요레 한나 차차만 디 위제티나 노흐요레 디 망라테니 똥니 위브저키 릭바양 제키오레 잠삼라 드니 더 위제트 하고 송나 더 똑송나 디 히럽 디 망라 뇽압 지르든기 히럽 제키오레 뇽압 지르든기 히럽
No song.
가레지는 디 위제티 똑니 뇽도 키오피 히럽 히럽 그 나츠 똥니 곰비 깔라 디 뇽압 지르든기 히럽 히럽 때 따와때 랑크 따와 랑크 비우 때 뇽압 지르든지 그래 Tendi karchembo chide ta kale kale ko ngon kerang tu nyo je ten kare ngi kale kale sha di wa tendi de tip shena tambo khombor nga kana ni zug lab shat zug chik pu te sha je zug tong ba os teni ogla chorwa tan du hindob shet tam chet ti ndrib jar ni hi do kyo tambo nga chu 똥 히럽기 강 통화를 샤비 똥닛 똥바니 코랑테 막달라고 합그 옌츠
So, where we are in the text is where it says form is emptiness, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, and form is not other than emptiness. These 4 lines of emptiness. And so now then we're beginning to examine what is emptiness. What does that mean? What defines emptiness? And then wisdom, profound wisdom, prajna, what defines that is that it is what realizes that empty nature, what knows that to be the case, what sees or realizes that to be the case is wisdom, profound wisdom here. And so then we're giving rise to that profound wisdom in our mind. And so the first is the process of then arriving at and determining the view of emptiness, basically coming to certainty or understanding of what that view is. The second is once we're certain of why and how things are emptiness and what it means, and we know that to be the case, then we meditate on that. There's meditation. So first, we call it determining the view, and second, employing that in meditation, practicing it. And I'm going to do my best to cover both of those topics here in today's teachings. And so first we have these lines, form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, and form is not other than emptiness. And these words are extremely profound. And correctly understanding them is crucial. It is our key to the wisdom insight that realizes the nature of all things, that realizes their empty nature. And so if we understand these 4 lines, then the effect is that we've effectively understood all of what emptiness means, because the understanding of emptiness is contained within these four. And so that's why they're sometimes called the four applications of emptiness. And then once we understand these four lines, once we've realized them, then that wisdom that knows that to be the case, then when we apply, then we integrate that experientially. And so then the practice is called the wisdom that experiences the four aspects, or these four lines. And so it's called the wisdom that had fourfold experience, because there's the direct experience of knowing that to be the case. And so these four then need to be present or complete in that experience. And so then when we meditate on emptiness, we could say there's a fourfold experience, that each of these lines, each aspect is understood. And so they call that fourfold experience. And Rinpoche said slowly, as we unpack these teachings, as we go through that process, then it will become more clear, and we'll speak of this more. So then in examining how all phenomena are emptiness, we start then by basically categorizing the entirety of our experience through what are called the 5 mind-body aggregates. And the first of these 5 is form. And then the other 4, if we've understood, for example, how form is emptiness, then we can easily understand how each of the other 4 are emptiness. We can apply the same reasoning and understanding to each. And so we begin with this first one, which is kind of the main process in which we arrive at an understanding of empty nature. Also.
Otere, teni ta tambo zuk zeti nang la, ta pembo ku dirta tipi chu cha tsama tandi zuk zeti nang yore, zuk ki pombo ji pa ti nang la yore. Ta zena teni nga tsu zuk, dra, zir, ro, raksha la sokpi. Nor na nga tsu tong tepa tang, tong matipi, dirta tipi pembo, yung su zokpa te, cha tsama te, laklu me par, uzuki pombo chi pa ti nang tu du yore. Ta te tongpa re song yore. Tanda kari ze kore, ze na na tangi kerang to lan dalab gu yore. Nga tsu shir tang ka, sosu kiawar nam ki nzin tang ta tangpo, nga tsu kari shi kanen rawa nzin ka yore, chu tam chala. Te hako gu yore. Nga tsu tani chu tam chip den trip tan nzin ka yore. 오야 덴트 지피 돈도 하고 그래 단디니까 땅웅이 때 캐랑 조직 쉣 덴트 지파테 회나 가리 나나 주구자 저로 럭샤라 속바 강나와 강카와 나추 차 참마데 나추 마르딱 막싯바 코랑 쯤도 용켄치 나추 정커요래 예니 코랑 데라 용켄치 예니 쯤 용켄다고 지라 종도 거래 나추 셈나라 예니 코랑 디망랍 뎀버 트파 제코레 예니 물동 이람 진짜 예니 덴트 비엠바치 가수 종코요레 더 소수 겨워 남기 은전땅레 대 간접신이 뜬디 지 랩송레 제나네 대타우 덴트 뜬즘비 로테 마릭파 제코레 가수 무부 니룩 마히파 무부 니룩 제타와진 맘통와 가상의 주의나 나추 루보랍 삼로 땅나양 나추 소수 개웅어라 나사 지그 차데 나추 가당 루파 빡발라 속바 탐쳇 나케오레 나룩 대하나 나추 덴트 따분전 그요레 예니 접용 괜찮전 그요레 옛나 더 쇼치그레 정이 주의나 가서 더 군접 공어라 나추 트루잉어라 나처럼 마르빙어라 나처때 대니 디 홍보디 추니 디 람신데 코랑 추르코레스 다르마다르토레스 람신 디 동니테스 디 차당아 좀 통회요 말 더 마음통이 더니 가수 샘그 마릭바집샤위 샘 대울로데 다 탐식 그 짜와 데리 덴트든 좀비 로 가수 샘나 요래 디 덴트든 좀비 로 디마라 가수 마릭바 제키요래 마히바 모바 회나 니르 강임바데 마히바 회나 코르위 짜와 마릭바라 투고래 둥거 그 짜와 마릭바라 투고래 디 독숙 둥거리 타르위 짜와데 화 가상아주 너바나 랍송아 너바나 지파 톱고 코나 디 짜와데 히럽라 투고래 데비 짜와데 히럽라 투고요래 코니 독숙로와 하고고 누가 어떤이 무슨 거 그래서 마릭바데 히럽 그 독숙래 랑 마음통와 잠식 마임 빠르네 마릭바제야테 독숙도 드롭딱 비블로지크 무부 니룩당 멈톤비 샘그 나준정 그요래 드니지 그래서
So, to understand the terms correctly, to understand correctly, we need to understand the definition of the term. So, forms is not what in the English definition. Forms includes the entire material universe, sounds, it includes physical forms, but also sounds, tastes, tactile sensations. Basically, all the objects that we perceive with our senses are called forms. They're called the aggregate of form. So whenever form, sometimes, when we say form, we're talking about it in the more ordinary way, like just the object of what the eyes perceive. But in the context of the five mind-body aggregates, forms means everything, all the objects of our perception. So you just have to know it contextually. And so in this case, the aggregate of forms is all forms, sounds, tastes, sense, and tactile sensations. Not just what we see, but also hear and so forth, all the sense objects. And in the entire universe, whether we perceive them directly in our experience or not, then essentially all of the sensory objects of the universe and so forth are called forms. And so that's a kind of a basic understanding of what that means. And so then it says form is empty. Furthermore, in order to understand correctly, then what wisdom is, we have to understand what the opposite is. So we need to identify what is our ordinary mind's way of perceiving. How does ordinary mind perceive reality? How do we grasp to? We perceive or we grasp, which means to conceive of reality as if that whatever we perceive is actually that. So we impute an inherent truth to that. A lot of translators will just say we think it exists, but the actual Tibetan term is a little more broad than that. So it includes thinking of it as existing, but I would translate that as we impute an inherent truth. We think that it's established as being that, as existing as that, and so on and so forth. Whatever our concepts of it are, we think that's what it is. And so then whatever forms, sounds, tastes, sense, tactile sensations, and so forth are arising to our perception, the aggregate of form, then all of it, then we don't investigate further. We don't examine further. However it appears to our perception, we think it's established as being that it exists as being that. So whatever it appears and however it is, we think that's what it is. That's its truth or that's its reality. So we're imputing an inherent truth, an identity or existence on that thing that doesn't account for or doesn't see that its nature is empty. And this is the ordinary mind's way of perceiving. Essentially, whatever appears to all of our different perceptions, then we think it exists as being that. We think it is inherently or truly that. And that assumption is ma rikpa in Tibetan, ignorance, or another translation is unknowing or unaware. So ignorance means that we don't know what its true nature is. We don't know what its natural state is. We don't see its nature. And so, as we were talking about yesterday, then essentially we think that whatever arises exists as it appears to us, like our body. We spoke about our body and our skin and flesh and muscles and bones and so forth, and we think that they are exactly as they appear to us, that they have an existence, as if they're like, that's what they are. They've always been that. They're timelessly that. That assumption and way of perceiving it as categorically being that is the way that appearances arise to a confused mind, to deluded perceptions, is an unknowing, is ignorance. Because we aren't knowing what the nature of that appearance is. We simply assume that it exists as being that. When we look at what is the actual nature of that aggregate, then we have terms like it is Dharmakaya, or it is Dharmadhatu, the basic space of phenomena, or it is empty by its very nature. And so then when we look at any given phenomena and we assume that it exists as we perceive it according to our perception, we are not recognizing its nature. We have a non-recognition, aka ignorance. And that ignorance, that non-recognition or unknowing, is the opposite to knowing. So unknowing or confusion or delusion or ignorance, it means basically that we are not knowing or perceiving the natural state, the actual nature of phenomena. And the very source of all of what samsara is, the very root of samsara boils down to this ignorance, this non-recognition. The root of all of our suffering boils down to this ignorance, this unknowing or non-recognition. Conversely, when we talked about the opposite potential, the freedom from suffering, we talked about that yesterday, it's called nirvana, which means a freedom from suffering. That comes from the opposite of unknowing, it comes from knowing. The source of, or wisdom. So this is where the words kind of lose a little bit of like when we say ignorance and wisdom, you don't really get the sense of unknowing and knowing, but typically we translate it as ignorance and wisdom. And so, but when you're trying to see the opposite, it can be helpful in just understanding that. So the root source of nirvana, transcendence of suffering, is wisdom, aka knowing. The root source of happiness is wisdom, aka knowing. So they're two opposite. One is knowing and one is unknowing. And their function and their result are opposite to each other. And so first we have to identify and look at what does unknowing, ignorance, or non-recognition of the nature of reality means. It means that we don't know, we're unaware of the true nature of reality. And on top of that, we actually believe things to be opposite to their nature. We perceive or impute an identity or existence on things that isn't what they are. So ignorance is not only unknowing, it's actually imputing an identity or truth to phenomena that is opposite to their actual nature. So it's extra. So,
Kima takto na bogo mamjer kima takto dawola samlo tangna kima takto ti tokpa mambo yo mare gorngi hipingola mikzung tongkyore nawi tetsorkyore lu geraksha nyongkyore ngatsu ti chasang nang zamjik yore tigni kamla denzin rakpa chik kege yo mare yenna gansam chigla tokchik hipa ke yongkyore zamba rakpa ke yongkyore teni dentripta ngunjur chenpo chik yongkyore denzam bogo tis gyalla teni gansam chigla teni te tokpa yarir cher rovi kabla ta pe denzin kublo nang zambo chik ngi kongdo yoye na ngaso nangwi cha chik ta nangwa kang yin na tela tongwi cha chik yore ta ton tamba zek yore korang ka niluk tongyi yin bicha tang tongwu yin to nangwi cha chik yore ti nangwi cha tela ngaso drop tak yore ngubu niluk tang mamtam bi drop tak ta yeni trip yon kan chik tokpa ka zong yore ti wakchak te kewa ndak chik pu tok mare ngaso tokma me pi tu nindi wakchak te komore marik pi wakchak te denzin ka wakchak te ti stop ki ngaso kongso yeni korang nangwa tar yurki toktor doluk ku trip yon sam yore korang tega rang la kantor tang yo na tela yeni trip duk yon kan chik shapa kanyang tang yo mare takpa yo mare shapa yo mare taga chik wakchak ka tom ku zong ko ta wakchak de kerang to trawa yo te kerwa why nga to tedi sem chi khas song se na wakchak de tukpo chik yo de di wakchak de marik pi denzeng ko lo de ha chang tukpo re nga to nang zam jik yenna da tong yin to nang yo re ta yenna ti stang to nang wi thola drop tak ni nga to tedi drop tak yo wa ti sherna te ta u marik pa da tampo ke ni teni nga to karip she ko re phongbo nga to te phongbo yo wa ta pap du na zukki phongbo yo re teni nga to semo re du jerna phongbo nga yo re nga to par gi na phongbo nga yo re du jerna zukta semki phongbo yo wa ti cha te la nga to dak zeni yang nga to dak jip shabi den trup chik te nga den bare we nga to ta dak den trup chik yin sam ke de wa nga to tak pa yin ba dak chik ma to mo ni yo sam ke yo ma nga to dak chik po chik pa yin ba den trup yin ba teni rang wang da wo yin kan self identity da wo chik yin kan ka korang trup yon kan da wo chik nga to zeng kan do ga 더 yang tani nga tsu pongpo ndi tok to dak takpa tsam chik ndikhi yore. Yena nga tsu dak den chup to yang tokpi drop takre. Tak tsam ki ma chok par. Ti mangla den chup to zimpi lo ti mangla nga tsu pongpo la ka migni ti mangla ti den zin kub lo te la gangzak ka dak zin zek yore. Gangzak dak to zin ba sir. Nga o samya te den chup to zimpi lo yore. Te gangzak ka dak zin zek yore. Teni nga yo tsarni zong te ngi lakpa, ngi kangwa, ngi pya lak, ngi kangpa. Cha tsang den tup zong dwa. Nga tang nga yir zamba zaya de. Nga to teni khuk chenpo yore. Te gangzak ka dak zin zere. Teni chu jamba tamshib dak zin kek yore. Dak yo ni zhan yang zamba yore wa nga to nam tokun zamba. Teni ta nga to kong du yu pa nang rin chu tamshib kang nang nang tamshib ni tamshib de korang kang la nang wa te la trip yot sam kore den trip zipi lore. Di mang la chu jib dang zin zek yore. Kyang su phenomena chi la pindu we.
Yeah, we just say the self of phenomena, just like the self of the individual. Those are the usual two translations.
Zamba gyar gorwa ngo.
Yeah.
Ti den tup tu kawa yor wezine yo marwa. Ti goni kwena ore tati war the song. I
So
want to so many to say, oh my gosh.
he's getting excited. So when we look at when we're first born and we're a newborn, like a newborn baby, like the day they're born, they don't have fully formed concepts yet. So they're just beginning to have this experience of a little bit of seeing and hearing and smelling and touching, and there's just the mere experience of it. It's almost like they don't have conceptuality yet formed. And so it's like almost like a non-conceptual experience of just the experience of appearances. But then, and so at that point, in the beginning kind of life, there's this period as an infant where we're unformed, and the concepts that grasp to and think of things as being this or that, as existing as being this and that, and so forth, have not yet formed. And then slowly, as a child grows, as they go through the processes of growth, then the concepts begin to form, and they begin to have concepts about things and think this is this, and this is that, like that it exists and it's inherently true as being this or that. And their concepts become very like solid. My mother, my father, this and that, and so forth. And so gradually, then that grasping, the perception of things as being this or that, as and identifying and thinking of it as existing as that, that what we call perception or what we call grasping, conceptual grasping. It means we're perceiving it as something in a conceptual range. Then forms. And then it's not just merely appearing. Now that appearance has an identity. That is this or that, I or my, and all of these different concepts begin to form around that and solidify around that and believe that it exists as being what we conceive of it to be. And so then we aren't, the truth of the reality is that it merely appears. There's the mere appearance of it, and while it is appearing, it is emptiness. So there's the appearance, what we're perceiving, and that's the apparent aspect. And then there's its natural state, its actual nature, which is occurring simultaneously always as its nature, which is the emptiness aspect. But ordinarily, we don't ever get to the emptiness aspect of things. We focus solely on the way things appear, and we believe those to exist as they appear to our perception, and so we're having a non-recognition of what they actually are. Our mind is perceiving them opposite to their nature. And we think they are exactly what they appear to be, as if they exist as being that, and that they're always that, timelessly established as being that. And this is because we have long-term or long-standing habituation to a non-recognition of their true nature, to ignorance. Not just in this lifetime, but all those before, all those that come before. Since time immemorial, we have had the habit to believe things exist as we conceive of them to be. And so that child, even though in the very beginning of the physical development as an infant, has the seed potential, the habits for conceiving of things in terms of existing as being this or that and so forth, but that hasn't yet, the conditions haven't yet awakened fully until their kind of full development takes place. So there's just the beginning. For example, when we think about when we're young, some habits come very quickly for children.
when
For instance, like
ngatu
the
tundro go pugu
like
mangbo
if we look at like animals, the
kema thak
habits that we
when
label as like
chik
instinct.
ka jini kyang
For example, like the moment they're born, even within
khala
1
tan yo
hour,
khala tan
they know that they want to
khala
eat,
tan
and
Tani
they
nama nikhi
know how
Ami nama.
to find their mother's nipple
Zaki
and
hiyo.
nurse.
oh yeah tani te hi yore te
And so
kani
there's a
fyong
knowing
to wak chikre
that we already come into,
ngama
like
tani
even if we haven't yet formed a concept of it, and
trogo
that's
nang la yo pick up
because of
marata
habituation.
trogo nang la yo pick up ka wak chik marata
It's not the habits of the stomach.
ti ami wum ka nang la yo pick up la khonzu nama
Then
ni swa ta te mare
It's not because they were nursing in their mother's womb.
te mare ti wak chik ti ngun ni
It's
wak chik
because
yo
that habit came from a before then, a previous
ngin
time
sam
of
tsemo
habit.
che yore
Sometimes I like to joke.
khonzu
I'm like,
karib shini khanam chugya ki go
how do they even know that, like, for example, to put the nipple in their mouth?
karib shini nanam chugya
Why don't they put it in their nose?
yin na wak chik
The
kholang deri
habit is so strong that, instinctually they know what to do.
nga chu nang pi kewar ngap shi de birik pa
So,
chik rete
this is one of
Kewar nga ma
the
yupi
forms
duk
of
shek.
consideration of logic for past and future lifetimes. When we look at the power of a habit coming into this life,
rik pi
that-
nam tang chik
then
rete
that's one of the many
te nga la
varieties
te
of
li thabo
reasoning.
yin bala nga da wo
It's
yin na
a
pe
simple
ma te pi
one,
te ga ge yo
And for me,
rik
it's
pa
one
te la
I really like appreciate that
I
logic.
know your America have that the answer there I know that kong chu kare je ko zena
The answer,
then
in the West
sano
is
tene
like
sile instinct
it's instinct.
instinct ze kyore
So they've given
Mama
that
bu tela
habit a name,
instinct ze
and they
kyore
say, "Oh, that's instinct."
yin na yang
However,
nga chu yambi myowa kang yin na nga chu ngam chik mam
when
nyung
we
ni zong
look,
te
if
kang
we've
lan ju khi
never
ma
experienced something, we don't know what to
kang
do.
lan ju khi ma do
We don't know how to engage it, how
nga
to
chu mu chi na
enact
la
it,
ju mam nyung a
because we've never experienced it before.
nga chu nyam nyung men kan chi la
So when we
ju
have
khi ma
no
do
experience, we don't know
Ju
what to
khi
do.
ma do.
We can't engage.
instantly kar khi so
So then how come there's
Yen na
this
khong
thing
chu
that's
kar
instinct?
zina
Why is there this exception where there's some things that we just do know how to do?
the same ki wak chi yin ba te ma
So
khi
from the
ni
Buddhist perspective, then
no khong chu chi
from the Western perspective, it's because they
Same
can't
ki wak
account
chik
for
lan tabya yo
habituation
ma.
of the mind prior to that moment of birth.
Teni
And so
khong chu
since that can't
instinct
be
ze
accounted for, then we have to call that habit something. So it's been called instinct.
That's a little bit funny. Repeat mandu sam ka do.
I don't know that I see the logic of instinct
Ngama
alone with
nyam
no
sok tan
prior
ni nyom mam
factors,
nyong kan chik te.
no prior
Ta tran
habitual
ho ya chik yore.
tendencies or imprints, and nothing connected with that
Ngama
consciousness
nyam
at
sa mam
all.
nyong ka wa te
Because
tran ya
instinct
yo
is
ma.
like memory. It's like remembering something.
How?
It's like knowing what to do.
Teri.
So how can you know what to do and remember something if it's never happened before?
So yeah, it's okay. That's a part that we're not talking about.
Okay.
So this is the later we have. There is 12 links teachings in this text. So we just next month. I think we're going to teach a second, weekend. So this time I'm going to stop this here.
So continuing, we have this habituation towards a non-recognition, towards ignorance, in which we believe things to exist as they appear. We think they're inherently or truly whatever they appear to our perception, whatever objects appear. And this belief is not one that is based on a thorough examination. It's just based on assumption that things are what they appear to be. And that comes from our habituation, from long-term, deeply habituated, deeply imprinted habits in our mind stream that are very dense and very strong. And so we have the habit towards ignorance, towards not recognizing the true nature that's like almost automatic because it's so strong in us. But as we begin to really examine what is actually the case, that we can see that appearances merely appear, and that while they're appearing, they are empty. And so then this is the kind of beginning to sort of unravel the sort of conceptual elaborations born of our ignorance. So when we look at that process, then we have when we look at what's the source of the, even though phenomena are empty, we believe that they exist. There's that we have a non-recognition of their true nature. And then how does that play itself out in our experience? When we look at the aggregate of forms, we have the aggregate of forms, all the forms that we perceive. And then we have the other four aggregates, which are the aggregate of mind. So if we wanted to make it really simple, we could say forms and mind, basically all the objects that we perceive and the mind that perceives them. And then based on the objects of perception, then amongst forms, we have our physical body, and then we have our mental experience, and we impute the identity of a self. Not recognizing their true nature, we think there is a self, and that there's this identity of I or me that truly exists, and that self is permanent, that self is singular, like we don't think I'm two, we think I'm one. That self has an inherent truth, there's an identity there, a self-identity that exists as ourself. And so essentially, in relation to the mind-body aggregates, we have imputed the concept of a self, and we think that that self exists. And as we relate to our body and so forth, we think in terms of I and mine. And this is what is called the self of the individual, that believes that in relation to that physical form and mental or conscious experience, that there is a self that exists. And also,
Teni kongsu yang daksa te kare kogorezena nga tso lupo yung kanta nga tso lu tang ngak tang yitsum yo pa tela pshir tang ka nga tso nga rao chik zeki yo rawa ti nga te zeki yo marta lu ngak yitsum ko cha la nga tso lu nga re sam ka yo mar sem nga re yang sam ka yo mar ngak te nga re sam ka yo mar lu ngak yitsum tsukpi tang la when nga jip sapi nzamba ka nam tok ching dowa o ti teni nga jip shawa te tela drop tak yore ti tok tela nga chu nga jip shawa nzeng ka dowa o ti yur tu kirpi nga te eze yore tak sarwo nga chu hako gore ma to mo yang kyang chu o nga kang sak ching dala yore the individual chig as sentient beings here that is me sam ka yore ragrak sam lo tang na yena mare jipper sam lo tang na nga chu lu nga re sam ka yo ma lungar yexum ngare sam ka yo marta yinna tani tetak lu tang mandrawa ngak tang mandrawa sem tang mandrawi nga chi nga chu zong yo re oya te ko go yo re.
So just a little clarification here on this when looking at this concept of self. So in general, then when we think I, it's usually in relation to the experience of our body and speech and mind. And we have the sense of an I in relation to those things. But if we look closer, then the I is not the body, the I is not the speech, and the I is not the mind. Rather, in relation to the assembly of body, speech, and mind, then we think of an I as something that's other than those things, that exists autonomously in and of itself. And that's the self that we're speaking of now. So we think that becomes the object of perception, when we think I and me as a self. Something that is not those three things, but is its own sort of individual autonomous thing that exists as being a self. So it's not just like a general sense of us as an individual, as a collection of body, speech, and mind, but then it's this solidified sense of a self that is other than the body, speech, and mind that exists. That is some identity that is there, that it's not the body. We don't think the body is I. And it's not the speech. We don't think that's I. And it's not the mind. It's different from those. It's something else that's other than those. And that's what we're talking about when we say the belief of a self. That there's some identity that exists inherently and that we think of as I. And that's called the self-clinging, the perception of self. And then in relation to the self, then there's my hands, my legs, my body, my things, my possessions, my house, and the list goes on. And so then everything, it becomes sort of encirculated around this sense of the concept of I and my. And then I'm not okay, and this and that, and go on, so on. And so that concept of there being some identity that is a self, that's autonomously and singularly there somehow, is called the concept of, or the grasping to, the self of an individual. And then everything that is not that self is other. And then we identify and grasp to others, and that's called the identity of other phenomena. So all the other phenomena are then given a label, and we think that it exists as being like that, and this is this, and this is that, and this is this, and this is that. So all other phenomena that is not the concept of self is called the grasping to the identity or the self of phenomena. And so these are sometimes what are referred to as the two selves that we grasp to. And we think that they exist, that they are inherently or truly something, but they aren't. And that's what we're starting to look at here.
Tere. Yeah, tere. Teni ta kansak dak tang chu kip dak zip shawi. Nga tu nzambak ni ki yur te chu kip dak zin tang kansak dak zin ki yur te la. Nga tu dak tan zong khyo re. Khwe nam phombo la ka migni teni phombo khorang dentub re sam khyo re nga tu. Teni tis tang la dak zip shawa yang dentub te yo sam nga tu nzang khyo re wa. Kansak tak chu re. Kansak dak ta phombo thola tak khyo re. Tak chu re. Tis tang tak khyo re. Teni dak zip phombo khorang yang dentub zong khyo re nga tu. 차장 덴트도 좀 그요래. 대니 당아투 디나니 당보 봉보 응안데 람신도 고송나 덴즈는 니까야. 지와당 덴즈는 니까야. 덴즈 니깐 좀비 마릭바양 지르로 톱크요래. 당전 니까양 지르로 톱크요래. 회나가수 따다 강석 레레랍 당전 첨보요 비김선기 가수 젠전. 데 젠전니 되니 뉴모 바강 회나 노밤 탐에 방아서 요러봐. 데 간입 정도 nga라봐. 짜 nga리. nga란데 구구도 nga라테 구구도 젠도밤 탐에 뛰어래. 초기 매빈도 빠요래. 야, 컨트롤랑나야 ngala mandik ni 컨트롤랑 해요래. 야, 착독 깨나야 되니 janki posum 속발랑맹 님 착독 깨나 ngani 용요래. ngan전니 집도 크도가 되니 ngar길 깨나야 ngani 용요래. ngan들이 자 I'm like this, I'm like that 제기요래. 대답은 군혼 노치 제르당 तमुक देव जिंतो ngachu karre ngargerum thak thola sopui nyumo ba hajama boyore di goni semche namlak no papshe kyore tangsan zambu lang ka chesani 말 총산이 삼로 떠나 강서 게르노 바탐시딩 대립 주크노 nga su nyamnyong ko tok yore. I'm not talking about the story of fictions. Ni nga su mitsi nang ke nyamnyong, nga su 강서 chik ke nyamnyong ko nang la tapsha ko kyang su ta da rang rang so so re mare. 강서 rang rang so su kangar tang nyugda tang sem nang ke nyumo pa tang tani jignang tang semcher tang tokpa tang techum tang hali ma boyo pa techo yang di dangzen tang di marik pa techo ngopchuk yong ko duarang ke nyumo pa techo tani jan la no pa ma po shi ni li ma po sak yong ko duwa lunga yeksam ki merge bi li ngam pa ma po sak duwa tanga cho kang sak chik tang la hueb jigna tani ke kangan yog da tham che teni yong ko yore di marik pa den zam ko lo to yopi topki 대마자 최사님 삼로 땅은 직등 감거 가수 땅상 거 머남 기nyogda tenro nam 기nyogda 단ong 머당 tenro 강 마임비 샘점 삼지 뭐 잡아마보 대덕 탐치 기nyogda 강을 용족대 간이 용회오래 내니 용회오래 겨나주 따다 땅상 가수 gerkap 밖에 좁바대응 간이 용회오래 탐치때 늘다부 마릭 비집죽니 용거도가 어떤 일이래서
So we have the identity or self of the individual, and then we have the identity or self of phenomena. So we have two selves or two identities that we're grasping to: the identity of phenomena and the identity of the individual. And so when we look at that, for example, the identity of the individual, then that comes about in relation to our body and mind, and then we think there is a self, something that is separate from those things, that isn't identical to them. And we think that it's real and that it's true. And so it's an imputed concept, imputed upon the basis of the experience of mind-body aggregates. And then on top of that, the basis for the concept of self itself, for example, our body and so on, we think of that as being true and existing and so forth in its own right, of having its own identity and so forth. When we begin to understand the true nature of the five mind-body aggregates, then these two imputations of identity, the identity of the self of the individual and that of the self of phenomena, begin to collapse, begin to subside or recede. And the ignorance, the non-recognition that perceives and conceives of those two as being true and real also is subsiding, is receding. So what happens when that intense identification with ourself, the self of the individual, begins to recede? Then that begins to, and then that phenomena, it changes our experience. So if we look at what happens when that identity is really strong, when we're holding intensely to the identity of the self of an individual, the more that we grasp to ourself, then the more that there is the sense of grasping to others. The stronger that self-focus and then that perception of others as being separate from that and so forth is, the stronger our disturbing emotions. It is from that concept of ourself and the intensity of that we have endless desires, and needs. I need this. I need that. I need this. Whenever you look at desire and needs and wants, you can see that it comes from the identity grasping to a self, thinking in terms of a self. And it is insatiable. It doesn't ever reach contentment. It just constantly wants. And then from that constant want, then we get upset and angry when we don't get what we want. And so then we have anger. I'm not okay. This isn't okay for me, and so forth. Again, where does anger come from? From that belief in relation to self and other. And then we have jealousy when we see, or envy for what others have, and discomfort in their abundance and successes. And all of that comes from self-clinging, the grasping to, the perception of a self. And then pride, I'm this, I'm that. And our belief of who we are also comes from the belief in that fundamental grasping to and belief in a self. So all of our disturbing emotions, whenever we have afflictions of the mind, whether it be desire or aversion or ignorance, pride, jealousy, the full range of how we are mentally afflicted, all of this is happening because of self-clinging, because it sprouts from or comes from that concept of and identifying with ourselves. And then those lead us to causing harm to others. So we have both the personal sufferings that this misconception of self brings, and then we have the kind of whole world suffering that on a bigger scale. So on a small scale, it's all the personal sufferings that we experience in our lives. Rinpoche said, I'm not talking about fiction here. I'm not telling you some story. This is something that you look at your own experience and you see, is it true or not? So an individual, each of us as individuals, we have all these disturbing emotions. We have so much fear and anxiety, and we're suffering over all of these things. And at the core and always present in those is our identification with ourself and a non-recognition of that nature. And then all of our disturbing emotions, we're constantly afflicted. And then those move us to engage in actions physically, verbally, and mentally that cause harm to others in all kinds of ways. And this is all just looking at our own individual and personal experience, the hardships that we have and the problems and issues that we have, all stemming from this non-recognition of our true nature and this belief in a self. And then on the greater scale, you have all of the harm that beings experience, all of the problems and struggles that human beings have, the problems that animals have, the problems that other living beings that we don't experience in our direct reality and so forth have, wherever they are. We have the greater world problems, the disputes between nations and so forth. If we look at where does all of that stem from, and we follow it back, and those afflictions, and we follow that lead to those actions, and we follow those back, where we arrive at the foundation or very basis from which those come is a non-recognition of true nature. Boils down to this belief in the identity of ourselves and others. Also.
오야 데니 다 데르타브레스 다땡아수 세수 깨워 남기 gember ken surtang zentang dendrup ke zamba denzen mark pati top ke chu dang zentang mark kansak dang zen ke mark pati top ki garif she dyong khadux oter ta wona teni terta u nga chu kangar tang nyog da tang dungar tham she mark palip shong go yodna te jivar she gona kare go kore zena ngubu niluk thongwi hirap te juk go kore ser ona terta un juk gona ten juk par she pa kare go khando zena ne teni niluk 돈 담발라 추탐치기 단데라 더니 추탐치기 랑신 똥니 딤바테 고히고 그도 uk세레 추탐치기 랑신 똥니 임바 고히고 그도 uk 뎁샷 동크요레 땡고히비 히럽데 결라 깨나는 득도크요레 더니 마릭 파팡 탑크요레 드라마탐 트라트크요레 디프셔나 tek hiper shepala tambo chutham kirani toni yinluk de tokpa hako go kyore ta ti yinluk de dina la zuk tomba o soni tawo nga zum changjib zon sa te zuk tomba o ji ba ko ngo tsukre oteni res
So now we begin to get a sense of the way in which ordinary beings operate, how we're constantly perceiving things to have truth and imputing a reality, a self, and an identity in each and every aspect of our experience. So we have the imputation of the identity of a self of an individual, and then the imputation identity of the self of phenomena. And all of those are non-recognition of true nature, and then we can see what comes from those. So once we recognize that's the root cause of our problems, the source of our difficulties, then if we want to bring about a subsiding, if we want to pacify that, then what do we need? We need the wisdom that sees the natural state, that sees their true nature. So then if we want to cultivate that wisdom, how do we go about doing that? Then we need to see the empty nature of all phenomena, how ultimately the nature of all phenomena is emptiness, is empty of having that truth and all that we identify with these ways and these ways in which we identify. And so once we recognize the root source of our problem, we want to cultivate the wisdom that recognizes true nature. And that is what directly eliminates the ignorance that does not recognize our true nature and all of the subsequent problems or flaws that we have as a result of it. So the first thing that is to be known is this statement, form is empty. And so then that's the first kind of beginning point in which we start to kind of unravel this unknowing and misconception of reality by starting with this first line that form is empty. That's all.
어때 다 때타고 때 tambo zukte ton tambala toni dimba 대하고 그래 건접도 다르니도 아주 희바 남히 죽고 뭐라 너 잠시 카르케요레 또 건접세레 디 건접디 열룩 다르뚝 바데 돈 담발라 까레레 제레오나 다돈 담발라 돈이 되제 다 열룩 까레레죠 how 제게요 바데 당이 내 돈이 열룩 때 셔땅급 샬룩 망보요레 르비고니 샬룩 하장 그만보레 등아조 되니 가상샤피 юм치모 히르기 파르투 신비 갈라밤 지그니 요 파레제한테 꽉꽉도 신나 때리 지주 키피임데리 탄주 삼키마 캬피마 보요레 릭비 남타 마부고니 되니 송요레 옛나가 조테초 차상 너무 이반로 위두초 요마라 탐책 그나니 릭바 마보요레 릭바타 호이고니 똥크요레 때 옛나 때니 릭바테 가상이 캬나솔라 유이나 나와상기비 lam kırjirtente mare konzoptan ton tamba kırnilukti konzoptan ton tambe tamshik tamchete kare goni yonkyorezena temjir goni yonkyorez divsherna teni tenjam revrim jongwa yimbi shir ze yirikpati gogre temjir yimba tag gonoyore ta teni temjir yimba kandipshini tag gonogundu zena ne 당아주 회나가주 땜질 기릭바 지바티 톡니 대페 리하오지 고톱 그래 다 아메리케양 디릭바데 고와 룬톱이야 지게 가르즈나 계란 소양 산익바 남라양 디 땜질 땅 뚜줍 그릭바다고 라운다오지 요레 계란 수 날지 그나 디 땜질 땅 뚜줍 그릭바데 요레 다 땜질 임바 간립시니 뜨고로 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 요레 다 땜질
So,
Tezena teni chu tamchet tenni mjongwa am yangna tenni takpari. Gyurken la tenni kaki mjongware, kaki gyurken la tenni takpari. Teni tutupri, panson chiki chila tuni yopade. Di goni ngubo tamchet teni resri. Temjer zibata teze kiore. Ta te yembi gemsante kar rezena ne, huena ngatsu ngimdan la yopi, metok, ta ngatsu metok pamman dezo, nyang jemondoga, teni indi metok pamman dezo zugre, qayib tang katok yore. Teni raksha yore, raksa yore, tre yore, ro yore, zugda, tre, ro, raksha chatsang tsang kanka, ngubo, teni chigre. Di metok telap samlo tangna, ko nangwa nang zamjik yore te, wonchang tani ko ton tambala, kwarang temjir ke rikpi takna, ku ramjin matapar chaktab ke yore se. Ton tambala matapa, ton tambala ramjin ki tomba res. Ton ku ramjin to churku res, damadata res. Many people like that word. That's why I'm using. Tani res.
so forms, ultimately, their nature is emptiness. But relatively, then they merely appear. To the perceptions of our senses, we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch them. That's their relative way of merely appearing. So then when we're like, well, how do they appear relatively and how are they empty ultimately? The way in which that takes place, there are many different, when we're looking at, for example, emptiness, there are many different explanations and different kinds of reasoning or logic that can lead us to the conclusion that everything is empty. And there are lengthy explanations. As I mentioned yesterday, the main volumes or texts of the Prajnaparamita of the perfection of wisdom is there are 12. And then main volumes. And then there are numberless commentaries by authentic masters, authenticated commentaries on their intent, on the meaning of that, and all kinds of logic and reasoning and examples and different angles to investigate and examine extensively. But one form of investigation, which is at the core of the Buddhist path, which I've been speaking of, which actually accounts for not just then the empty nature, but also the relative nature. So the reason why they appear relatively and is the same reason why they're ultimately empty. And this is because they are dependently occurring. So this is one of the kind of main forms of logic that from this alone, it establishes why they appear on a relative basis and what their ultimate nature is as well. We can understand that just from understanding dependent origination, what it means to be dependently occurring. And this logic is particularly accessible to Westerners because already then much of how you learn is understanding the dependent relationships between things like cause and result and so forth, or how they're mutually defining and so forth. And so it's already in scientific, like the science is basically very much based on dependent origination and looking at what causes what and the relationship between the mutually defining and mutually dependent relationships between things, which is how we have science and its discoveries. So it's already something that's very compatible. And so we'll use this as our first to examine, use that as a logic to understand And so dependent origination can mean two things. It can mean like a cause and result relationship in which something occurs in dependence upon and in relation to like specific causes and conditions, it's dependently occurring. Or it can be mutually defining, where then you can only define this in relation to that, and so then it's also dependently occurring as well. And so these are two forms of kind of dependence. Um, and, um, and so then we'll look at it from this example. And so, for instance, Rinpoche said, right in front of me are these beautiful lotus flowers. They're quite pretty. But let's just use one of these as an example. So this is a form, falls under the aggregate of form. It has a color and a shape. It also has, when you touch it, it has a tactile sensation, it has a smell, it has a taste, and so it's an object of our senses, form, sounds, taste, sense, and tactile sensations, all of them. And so then this flower is merely appearing. But ultimately, then its nature cannot be established to exist, to have an inherent established truth. It's not, there's nothing that is timelessly like existent as being that thing in the way that we relate to things as having an established existence as something. And so ultimately, by its very nature, it is empty. And this is what, then we use these Sanskrit terms, it is Dharmakaya or it is Dharmadhatu. Rinpoche said, I know people like those words, so I'm just using them here. Nasa?
대닝이 갈템접시하고 그러와.
Re, Tendril.
야야야 대. 대니 대스타부 템저때 템저 임비 gem선 기더니 gem선 디스톱긴데 돈이때 체크요레 제때 다회나 가레레 제나나 템저 임비 gem선데 규통 낀라 때니 템저 급숑요레 더 기메 팔립숑 마송 디 메토 데초 회나 건조부터 나준더 기메 립숑 마송 건조고 숑르탄데 코랑 간뎁시니 숑레 제나나 타르니트 메토 밤마가 주 코랑 사분요레 즉 데니 낀 치당 르당 쪽실라서 바가레요나 데초요레 데초랍데니 데니 코데 숑레 코랑 예니 트비오 빠칭데라 렙마소 데랑 예니 트비용 칸칭 마레 당모 짜와니니 멘칸치레 코랑 메톤드 옛나양 데니 그 유르킨 데초랍데니 데라 나소 회나 사운 코랑 그 토라양데 요레는 요말 메토코 사운 그 토라 요말 메토코 킹그 토라 킹 잠바남기 토라양 메토코 요말 다 디브시나 데라 텐니숑송 교통kel라 텐니숑송 데니 교통kel라 텐니숑나 오나 유르킨 템리 립숑송와 옛나 코랑 랑왕 고니 유르키 돌루코 고니 예니 쯤메 파임바 덴트 마임바치 간딥시니 하코도 요레 제나 코잔라 투후요레 제 코랑 유르키 남라 투니 나 잠바치 숑송 나 잠지 그래 나레 르바 코랑 소니 존테 잔라 투 차니 존테 코랑 쭈마리 회나 멜론은 그 중년때 있나요? 나츠 뜻된 좀 정해요 말. 년무니까 그 죽때 나츠 된좀 정해요래. 가립신이 멜론은 그 중년때 나츠 된좀 정해요 말에 제나네. 자 코랑 다가직더니 멜론 땅 나츠 ngola tenni 나위 남년 잠지 그래. 디겼겠나 tenni 나 잠지 하고 요래 나츠. 직파 직장 착성. 내영 가르제나 교통ken니 나와 잠지그래. 땜질기 나와 잠지그래. 땜질기 나와 있나 컵 주마리. 주마제나 낭낭 흐요르다 돈기 토나 돌루고 고니 예니 줍용 칸치 마리세. 디브시나 우죽동바오제나 메동도 동바오세. Gimson Karana Temri in Bichers at the Terry Gimson. Temri in that 2 to Chakdokiore, Panson to Stuni Mabjakna, Kornaya Yomar, Koran Tribion Kanchi, Ranguni Triptum Kanchi, Yungu Yomar. Tifshena Ramjin ki Matapi, Melon Zunian Tawchik Chaksonga. Koran Ranguni Trip Menayang, Nang Tokyopi, Melon Zunian Tawres. Huh? Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, Lepson. Yeah.
So, to begin with, first, then we're saying this lotus is empty. So then why? The reason is because it is dependently occurring. So that's the reason, that's the logic. This is empty. Why? Because it is dependently occurring. That means because the appearance of a lotus is dependent upon other causes and conditions. It didn't come about from no cause. Like relatively nothing can come about without a cause. And so the lotus came about in dependence upon and in relation to a seed, a lotus seed, a specific kind of seed variety, its specific cause, along with all of these very specific set of causes and conditions, the right amount of moisture, nutrients, heat, earth and soil, and so forth. And then in dependence upon and in relation to those causes and conditions, then there's the mere appearance of a lotus, but there isn't a lotus that exists in dependence of those factors, in and of itself, like this, timelessly or always a lotus. It's only appearing in dependence upon and in relation to other causes and conditions, but not by its own right. And the more that you examine this, for example, at the time of the seed, there is not a lotus inside the seed, nor the contributing conditions of water and nutrients and so forth. There is not a lotus inside of all of those things. All that we can say is in dependence upon and in relation to that wide range of causes and conditions, then there is the mere appearance of a lotus occurring in dependence upon those factors. There's no autonomy. There isn't a lotus that exists in its own right, that's autonomous and inherently existing as that without those other factors, without being in relation to those other factors, in dependence upon those other factors. So the appearance is only happening because of that relationship, because of that dependency. And so the appearance is a contrived appearance in dependence upon and in relation to other factors. Contrived being like something that's a product or produced or dependent on those other factors. When we look at a reflection on the surface of a mirror, we don't think there's actually an object that exists there. Not in the same way as our waking sort of daytime experiences in which everything that appears, we think it exists. It's whatever we believe it to be. But when we consider the reflection of a mirror, like the reflection of the flower on a mirror, we know that it's merely an appearance. Why? Because it's merely appearing due to other causes and conditions. But in actuality, the same goes for everything else that appears in our experience. It's merely appearing because of other or in dependence upon other causes and conditions. It doesn't exist by its own right in any autonomous way as being that thing not in relation to those other factors. It's dependently occurring. And so then we say form is emptiness. Why? Because it is dependently occurring. That's the reason. It isn't existing in and of itself ultimately or timelessly or in any other way. It doesn't have its own existence. It can only occur in relation to other factors, in dependence upon other factors. There's no autonomous sort of self or inherent existence of that thing on its own. And so it is empty by its very nature. Just like a form that is reflected on a mirror, which we say appears only because of other causes and conditions, and therefore does not have its own sort of inherent or autonomous existence in and of itself. So that's as far as we're getting. We're right. We're
It's
like
lunchtime.
right in
Yum,
there, but
yum,
it's
yum.
lunchtime.
It's a yum, yum time.
Okay. So again, we'll return at the 1.5 hour mark. So it's like we're not going to worry about minutes. So it's like 1 o'clock right now. So we'll return here in Arkansas at 2:30.
Sonamandaye tamche
Tamjen
zipanye
zingani
tomni nipe danam tamshe
tamshene
kega nanche varlon tupai sabin tolin roa tovar sho kewa kondo yang toga lama rame chuji varla longcho satan lamje yontai rabzoni Dorje changke gomba